For 6 years, her own brother called her a burden, told everyone she was too big, too plain, too old to marry. He kept every penny she earned and gave her scraps from the kitchen floor. Then one day, he found someone desperate enough to take her, a stranger out west who'd never even seen her face. What Nora didn't know? Her brother sent a photograph of a beautiful woman who wasn't her. When she stepped off that train and saw the man holding that picture, when she watched his face change from hope to confusion, she wanted to disappear. But Wyatt Garrett didn't send her back. Instead, he said 5 words that changed everything. You can stay a week. What happens next will shatter every lie she ever believed about herself. Because sometimes the people who call you too much are really just afraid you'll finally realize you're enough. This story is for every woman who was ever told she took up too much space and learned to shrink herself to fit someone else's comfort. Because you were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who couldn't handle your light. If you've ever felt like you needed permission to bloom, this story is your permission. Stay until the end, and if it speaks to your soul, share it with someone who needs to hear it too. The hotel kitchen was thick with steam and shame. Nora stood at the wash basin with her hands raw from lye soap, while her brother Edmund counted coins at the front desk. Her coins, earned from her labor. But nothing in this life belonged to her. Not her wages, not her time, not even her dignity. She was 28 years old and unmarried. In 1876, that made her a burden, a failure, a woman no man wanted. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the kitchen door with her tight smile and sharp questions. The woman ran the local Ladies' Aid Society, which meant she ran everyone else's business too. Nora, dear, she said in that sugary voice that always preceded something cruel, 28 and still unmarried. Do you not think it is time you found someone? Anyone? Nora kept scrubbing the pot in her hands. She had learned years ago that answering only made things worse. Edmund appeared behind Mrs. Patterson like he had been waiting for his cue. He probably had been. Her brother never missed an opportunity to humiliate her in public. I have tried everything, Edmund announced loudly enough for the breakfast diners to hear. Posted advertisements in 3 newspapers, paid 2 different matchmakers. He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. One man took one look at her and walked away without saying a single word. The breakfast diners turned to watch. Nora felt their eyes on her back like hot coals. Another wanted triple the dowry, Edmund continued even louder now. Said he would need it to feed her properly. Laughter rippled through the room. Someone snorted coffee through their nose. The Reverend's nephew moved to California rather than court her, Edmund added. Can you imagine? A man choosing to cross the entire country just to avoid my sister. More laughter. Nora's knuckles went white on the pot handle. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to false sympathy. You are such a saint, Edmund. Keeping her here after your parents died, most brothers would have sent her to the poorhouse years ago. Christian duty, Edmund said with a humble shrug that made Nora's stomach turn. Though some days I wonder if the poorhouse would not be kinder, for both of us. Nora wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the pot across the room and tell everyone the truth. That she worked 16-hour days in this kitchen. That Edmund had taken her inheritance when their parents died. That he kept every penny she earned and gave her nothing but a cot in the storage room and scraps from the kitchen. But she stayed silent. She always stayed silent. That was when Frank stumbled in reeking of whiskey. He came every morning to watch her work and make comments just loud enough for her to hear. Today he walked straight into the kitchen like he owned the place. Morning, Nora, he said with a grin that showed his rotting teeth. His breath was sour enough to make her eyes water. Still here? Thought your brother would have shipped you off by now. She did not answer. She never answered Frank. He leaned against the counter too close to her. You know I would marry you. Save you both the trouble. Edmund laughed from the doorway. Frank, my friend, even you can do better than her. Could do worse. Frank's hand landed on Nora's shoulder. She felt his fingers dig in through the thin fabric of her dress. What do you say, Nora? I need a cook. You need a roof. Simple arrangement. Simple. Nora tried to step away. His grip tightened. Or maybe. Frank's voice dropped to something dark and hungry. Maybe I will just take what I want now. Save us the wedding. His other hand reached for her waist. Nora's hand moved before she could think. The crack of her palm against his face echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Frank stumbled backward with his hand pressed to his cheek. His eyes went wide with shock, then narrowed with rage. The room went dead silent. Nora stared at her own shaking hand. She had never hit anyone in her life, never stood up for herself, never fought back. Edmund grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the back room. His fingers dug in hard enough to leave bruises. "Apologize," he hissed. "Right now." "He touched me," Nora said. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "So what?" Edmund slammed the door behind them. "You think you have choices? Look at yourself." His eyes ran over her like she was livestock at auction. Too big, too plain. "Too old. I have fed you and housed you and kept you employed for 6 years, and this is how you repay me? By assaulting a paying customer? I did not assault him. He was going to hurt me." Edmund laughed. "Hurt you? Who would bother? You are not worth the effort." The words hit like fists. Nora felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart. She had stopped letting Edmund break her heart years ago. This was something else, something deeper, the last thin thread of hope she had been holding on to. Edmund paced the small room with his jaw working. Then he stopped. His expression changed to something that made Nora's blood run cold. "Actually," he said slowly. He pulled an envelope from his coat. "This might solve everything." Nora's throat tightened. "What is that?" "I found you a position out west. A mail-order bride arrangement." Edmund smiled. A real smile. The kind that meant he had won. "No." Nora shook her head. "Edmund, no. You cannot just send me away like unwanted baggage. It is already done. I sent the acceptance letter last week. The man is expecting you. You had no right." "I am your legal guardian." Edmund tossed a train ticket on the counter. "I have every right. You leave in 3 days. Do not bother coming back, please." Nora hated the begging in her voice, but she could not stop it. "At least tell me who he is. What did you say in the letter? What did you promise him? Does it matter?" Edmund headed for the door. "No man here wants you, Nora. Just be grateful someone out west is desperate enough to take you sight unseen." He left her alone in the storage room with the train ticket burning on the counter beside her. 3 days. She had 3 days to prepare for a life she did not choose with a man she had never met. She did not know his name, did not know what Edmund had told him, did not know what awaited her at the end of that train ride. All she knew was that her brother had finally found a way to get rid of her. That night, Nora lay on her thin cot and stared at the ceiling. The train ticket sat on the small crate she used as a nightstand. She could not stop looking at it. Part of her wanted to tear it up, to refuse, to stay and fight. But fight for what? A life of scrubbing pots and enduring Edmund's cruelty? A future of Frank's wandering hands and the town's endless mockery? Maybe out west she would find something different. Maybe the man Edmund had found would be kind. Maybe she would finally have a home that was truly hers. Or maybe she was walking into something worse. The fear kept her awake until dawn. 3 days passed like a fever dream. Edmund did not speak to her, did not tell her anything about the man she was going to marry. When she tried to ask questions, he just smiled that cold smile and said she would find out soon enough. On Friday morning, the whole town gathered at the train platform to watch Nora leave. They came like it was entertainment, a show they had been waiting for. Finally getting rid of his burden, someone muttered loud enough for her to hear. "Wonder how long before she gets sent back. Poor man, whoever he is. Imagine opening your door to find that waiting for you." Edmund handed her a single small bag containing everything she owned. 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a photograph of her parents. Nothing else. "Train leaves in 5 minutes," Edmund said cheerfully. Better get on board. Edmund, please. Nora grabbed his arm. At least tell me his name. What does he do? What did you promise him about me? Edmund smiled. That thin, cruel smile she had seen every day for 6 years. I told him exactly what you are, he said. A desperate woman with no other options. Just like him. You two deserve each other. The train whistle screamed. Nora climbed aboard with shaking hands. Through the window, she watched Edmund walk away before the train even started moving. He did not wave, did not look back, did not care. She was alone. The train rattled westward, carrying her toward an unknown future with an unknown man. 3 days of strangers staring. 3 days of terror building in her chest. 3 days of wondering what she would find at the end of the line. What kind of man had Edmund found? What lies had he told? What would happen when she arrived? Nora pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the only world she had ever known disappear behind her. She had no idea that everything was about to change. She had no idea that the man waiting for her had been lied to just as badly as she had. She had no idea that the worst moment of her life was about to become the beginning of the best. The train finally stopped in a town so small it barely had a name. Copper Creek. Population maybe 300 if you counted the dogs and horses. 1 main street, 1 general store, 1 church, 1 saloon. That was it. Nora stepped onto the wooden platform with her legs trembling from 3 days of sitting. Her small bag clutched tight against her chest like armor. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She scanned the platform looking for someone who might be waiting for a mail-order bride. There were only a handful of people. An old woman with a basket of eggs, 2 men loading crates onto a wagon, a young mother chasing a toddler, and 1 man standing alone near a dusty wagon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and wind in a way that said he worked outside every day of his life. He wore simple clothes, work boots, a hat pulled low over his eyes. He was holding something in his hand, looking down at it, then looking up, scanning the platform. When his eyes found Nora, his whole body went still. He looked down at what he was holding, looked back up at her. His jaw tightened. His expression went from hopeful to confused to something that looked almost like anger. Nora's heart stopped. She could see what he was holding now, a photograph, a small photograph of a woman. Even from 15 feet away, she could tell it was not her. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, slender, delicate features, dark hair arranged in perfect curls, the kind of woman men wrote poetry about. Everything Nora was not. Edmund had lied. Her brother had not just sent her away, he had sent a false photograph. Promised this man a beautiful bride and delivered something else entirely. The man walked toward her slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden platform, his face unreadable. Nora wanted to run, wanted to climb back on the train and disappear, wanted to sink through the platform and never be seen again. But she stood her ground. She had nowhere else to go. "Miss Nora?" His voice was deep, quiet, careful. She could barely speak. "Yes." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see his eyes. They were brown, tired, full of something she could not name. He looked at the photograph in his hand, then at her face. The silence stretched between them, terrible and crushing. Nora felt the shame rising in her chest, the familiar burn of being found wanting, being found less than. "I am Nora," she said again because she did not know what else to say. "I am Wyatt Garrett." He tucked the photograph into his coat pocket. "I suppose you should know that right off." More silence. "I am sorry," Nora heard herself say. Her voice cracked on the words. "I did not know. I did not know what my brother told you. I did not know about the photograph until just now when I saw you holding it." She waited for the anger, the accusations, the demand that she get back on the train and go back where she came from. But Wyatt just looked at her with those tired brown eyes. "You have more luggage?" Nora blinked. "What? Is this all you brought?" He nodded at the small bag in her arms. "Yes." But I do not understand. I thought you would be angry. I thought you would send me away. Wagon is this way. Wyatt turned and started walking. Nora stood frozen on the platform. This was not how she expected this to go. None of this made sense. You coming? Wyatt called back over his shoulder. You still want me to? He stopped, turned to face her. His expression was still unreadable, but something in it softened just slightly. I paid for your passage, he said. You traveled 3 days to get here. The least I can do is offer you a roof over your head while we figure out what happens next. He did not sound angry. He sounded tired, resigned, like he had expected something to go wrong, and it finally had. Nora followed him to the wagon. He took her small bag and set it in the back without comment, helped her climb up onto the seat. His hand was rough and calloused, but surprisingly gentle. They started down the main street of Copper Creek. People stared, whispered. Nora kept her eyes forward. It is 15 miles to the ranch, Wyatt said. Long ride. You should know I am not much for talking. That is fine. Silence settled between them. Dust and sagebrush stretched in every direction. The sky was enormous, bigger than anything Nora had ever seen. She felt small beneath it, exposed. Finally, she could not stand the silence anymore. My brother lied to you, she said. I need you to know that I did not know. I did not ask him to send a false photograph. I did not even know he was arranging this marriage until 3 days before I got on the train. Wyatt's hands tightened on the reins. I figured it was something like that. You did? Woman in that photograph looked like she had never worked a day in her life. He glanced at Nora's hands, red and rough from years of scrubbing pots. You have worked plenty. Nora did not know if that was a compliment or an insult. Did you want to come here? Wyatt asked suddenly. The question hung in the cold air between them. No. The truth came out before she could stop it. I did not want to come. I did not know anything about you. I still do not know anything about you. My brother just told me I was leaving and handed me a train ticket. Then why did you get on it? Nora's throat closed. She looked out at the endless empty landscape, at the mountains in the distance, at the sky that seemed to go on forever. Because I had nowhere else to go, she said quietly. Something shifted in Wyatt's face. Not pity. Something harder to name. Something that almost looked like recognition. He turned back to face the road ahead. You can stay a week, he said. Work for room and board if you want. After that you decide. Stay, or I will pay your passage wherever you want to go. Nora stared at him. You do not have to do that. A week is all I am offering. His voice was firm. Then it is your choice. The wagon rattled on over the rough road. Nora sat in stunned silence, trying to understand what had just happened. This man had been deceived, had paid good money for a bride who did not exist, had every right to be furious, had every right to put her back on the next train and write her brother an angry letter. Instead, he was offering her the one thing no one had ever offered her before: a choice. The ranch appeared over the next hill. A weathered barn stood against the sky. A small house with a porch, fence lines stretching into the distance in every direction. It was not much, but it was beautiful in a way Nora had not expected. Wild and open and free. It is not fancy, Wyatt said quietly, but it is dry and it is warm. Nora climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were still shaking, but not from the long ride. Wyatt carried her small bag to the porch, opened the door. The house inside was sparse, clean but empty. A table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a single cot in the corner. No decorations, no curtains, nothing soft. I will set up a place for you in the barn loft, Wyatt said. Give you some privacy. I can sleep anywhere. I do not want to put you out. No, his voice was firm. You will have your own space with a lock on the door. He set her bag down and stepped back toward the door. There is bread and butter in the cupboard. Coffee on the stove. I will be in the barn if you need anything. He left before she could respond. Nora stood alone in the small house. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from something she had forgotten existed. Hope. Outside, Wyatt leaned against the barn wall and pulled out the photograph. The woman in it was beautiful. Everything the advertisement had promised. Everything Nora was not. He looked toward the house, saw her silhouette through the window moving around the small kitchen. She had been lied to. Used. Sent away like unwanted cargo. Just like he had been left behind when his fiancée decided ranch life was not good enough for her. Wyatt tucked the photograph back into his pocket. A week. He would give her a week. Then she would leave like everyone else. They always left. Nora woke before dawn. Old habits. She had been waking before dawn for 6 years to start breakfast at the hotel. The barn loft was cold but dry. Wyatt had set up a proper space for her with a real bed and thick blankets, and a lock on the door, just like he promised. She had slept better than she had in months. She dressed quickly in the gray morning light and climbed down the ladder. The ranch was quiet, peaceful in a way the hotel kitchen had never been. Wyatt was already outside working near the barn. She could see his breath in the cold air, could hear the sound of him splitting wood. She walked to the house. The kitchen inside was simple. A wood stove, a table, basic supplies on the shelves. She found flour, eggs, salt, a small crock of butter. Her hands moved without thinking, mixing biscuit dough, starting coffee, setting the table with 2 plates. When Wyatt came in 20 minutes later, he stopped in the doorway like he had walked into the wrong house. Fresh biscuits sat golden on a plate, coffee steamed in a pot. Butter and honey waited on the table. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know." Nora kept her eyes down. "But I could not sit still. I needed something to do." He sat and ate quietly. Did not compliment her cooking, but did not complain either. Just ate like a man who was used to eating alone. When he finished, he looked at her. "I am working the south pasture today," he said, checking the fence line. "Takes most of the day." Nora nodded. "I can clean the house. Wash some clothes if you need. There is something else." Wyatt stood and walked to the window, pointed toward the back of the barn. "There is a garden out there. My mother planted it when I was a boy. It is overgrown now. Grown. Been years since anyone tended it. But the bones are good if you want something to do. A garden." The word settled into Nora's chest like a warm stone. "Trees she planted are still there," Wyatt continued. "Apple, pear, cherry, strong old things. The rest needs work, but it might be something worth saving." He left before she could answer. Nora found the garden an hour later. It was bigger than she expected, much bigger. Raised beds choked with weeds, a wooden trellis covered in dead vines, stone borders half buried in dirt. And beyond all of that, standing tall against the sky, were the trees, 3 of them. Old and thick-trunked with branches spreading wide. An apple tree heavy with red fruit, a pear tree with golden leaves, a cherry tree with branches that reached toward the sun. Nora walked among the overgrown beds, pulled a weed here and there, felt the soil between her fingers. Rich, dark, full of life waiting to grow. Her mother had taught her about gardens before she died. Had spent hours with Nora in their small backyard showing her how to plant seeds and pull weeds and coax life from the earth. "Gardens are proof that broken things can grow again," her mother used to say. "All they need is time and care and someone who believes in them." Nora had not thought about those words in years. Edmund had sold their family home after their parents died. Sold the garden with it. Told Nora she was too clumsy to grow anything anyway. But here was a garden waiting for her. Abandoned, but not dead. Neglected, but not destroyed. Just like her. She spent the morning pulling weeds, clearing beds, finding the shape of what used to be. Her back ached. Her hands got dirty. She did not care. When she finally stood up and stretched, she found herself looking at the apple tree. Red apples hung heavy on the branches. Some within reach, some higher up where the fruit was always sweetest. She wanted to climb. The thought surprised her. She had not climbed a tree since she was 7 years old. Since the day Edmund caught her in the apple tree in their backyard and yanked her down so hard she scraped both knees. "Fat girls do not climb trees," he had said while she cried on the ground. "You will break the branch. You will embarrass me. You will hurt yourself." She had never climbed another tree. But Edmund was not here. No one was here, just her and the apple tree and the memory of being told she was too much. Nora walked to the tree slowly, put her hand on the rough bark, felt the solid trunk beneath her palm. She put one foot on the lowest branch. It did not break. She pulled herself up, found the next foothold, then the next. The tree held her weight. The branches creaked but did not crack. She climbed higher than she had ever been allowed to climb. When she finally stopped, she was sitting on a thick branch halfway up the tree. The view stretched out in every direction, fields and mountains and sky. More space than she had ever seen. She picked an apple from a branch near her head, bit into it, sweet and crisp and perfect. And then she cried. Not from sadness, not from fear. From something she had no words for. Something that felt like a door opening inside her chest. Like a knot finally coming loose. 21 years. She had spent 21 years believing she was too heavy for trees, too big, too much. And she had been lied to. She ate the apple and cried and looked out at the world from a height she had never been allowed to reach. When Wyatt came back at noon, he found her on her knees in the garden, a pile of pulled weeds beside her, dirt on her dress and her face and her hands. "Making progress," he said. "Your mother had good taste." Nora looked around at the cleared beds. This was beautiful once. Still is. Wyatt studied the garden. Just needed someone to see it. He looked at her hands, at the dirt under her fingernails. "You are good at this. My mother taught me before she died." Nora smiled. A real smile. The first real smile in longer than she could remember. She said gardens were proof that broken things could grow again. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he pointed to the apple tree. "Apples are ready. You want one?" Nora nodded. He reached up and picked one from a low branch, handed it to her. She took it, but her eyes kept drifting upward, to the high branches, to the apples she had climbed to reach. "You went up," Wyatt said. It was not a question. Nora felt her face flush. "I hope that was all right. I have never done that before." "Climbed a tree?" "Not since I was 7. My brother said I was too heavy, said I would break the branches." Wyatt looked at the tree, at the thick, solid branches that could hold 3 men. "Tree is old," he said, "strong. Been standing for 40 years. Takes more than one person to break branches like those." Nora looked down at the apple in her hand. "No one ever told me I could," she said quietly. "You can do a lot of things people never told you about." He turned and walked toward the barn. Nora watched him go. That afternoon she climbed the tree again, and again, and again. Each time she climbed a little higher. Each time the branches held. Each time she sat among the leaves and looked out at the world and felt something inside her shifting. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She had just been told she was by people who wanted to keep her small. That evening at dinner, Wyatt asked her what she had wanted to be when she was a girl. The question surprised her. No one had ever asked her that before. "I wanted to run," Nora said slowly. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere she had forgotten existed. "I wanted to climb trees and laugh without apologizing and take up space without feeling ashamed." "Then do it." Wyatt set down his fork. "No one is stopping you here." Nora looked at him across the small table, at this man who had been lied to just like her, who had every reason to be angry, who instead was giving her something no one else ever had, permission to be herself. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Because I know what it feels like to be told what you built is not enough, he said finally. My fiancée left me 2 years ago, said ranch life was too small, said I was too simple, said she deserved more. I'm sorry. Do not be. He shook his head. The problem was not the ranch. The problem was she could not see what was already here. He looked at Nora, really looked at her. You see it, he said. You look at that overgrown garden and see something worth saving. You look at that old tree and see something worth climbing. That is rare. Nora's throat tightened. You are not broken, Nora. Wyatt's voice was rough. You are just the first person who has been allowed to bloom. She cried then, for the second time that day. And for the first time, the tears tasted like hope. On the fourth day, everything changed. Nora was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard children laughing outside. She looked through the window and saw 4 of them running across the field behind the barn. 2 boys and 2 girls playing some kind of chasing game. She watched them for a while. The way they ran without thinking about how they looked. The way they laughed without covering their mouths. The way they climbed over fences and tumbled through grass and took up space like they had every right to it. She had never played like that. Edmund had not allowed it. Too unladylike, he said. Too loud. Too wild. One of the boys knocked on the kitchen door. His face was flushed and sweaty. Can I get some water, please, Mayam? We are playing hare and hounds, and I am real thirsty. Of course. Nora pumped water into a cup and handed it to him. What is hare and hounds? One person is the hare and runs and hides. The others are the hounds and try to catch them. The boy gulped down the water. It is my sister Emma's turn to be the hare. She is really good at hiding. It sounds fun. The boy looked at her with the straightforward curiosity of a child. You want to play? Nora opened her mouth to say no, to say she was too old, too big, too slow. But the words did not come out. I do not know how to play, she said instead. It is easy. The boy grabbed her hand. Come on, I will show you. Before Nora could protest, he was pulling her out the door and across the yard toward the other children. They looked up as she approached. 4 small faces, curious, but not cruel. Can Miss Nora play? The boy asked. The oldest girl, Emma, studied Nora with serious eyes. She was maybe 10 years old with braids and a gap-toothed smile. Can you run? Emma asked. I think so. Then you can play. Emma pointed to a cluster of trees behind the barn. We all count to 100. I go hide. Then everybody tries to find me. If you find me first, you get to be the hare next time. Nora felt Wyatt's eyes on her. He had come out of the barn and was watching from near the fence. He nodded slightly. Go on. The children started counting. Emma took off running toward the trees. Nora stood frozen for a moment. The last time she had run anywhere was 6 years ago, when Edmund had chased her through the hotel kitchen to punish her for breaking a dish. 98, 99, 100. Ready or not, here we come. The children scattered. Nora stood alone. Then something shifted inside her. She ran. Her skirts tangled around her legs. Her breath burned in her chest. Her heart pounded hard enough to hurt. But she ran. She ran past the barn and into the trees, ran through tall grass that grabbed at her ankles, ran toward the sound of children laughing somewhere ahead. She felt clumsy, slow, ridiculous. She felt alive. She found Emma hiding behind the apple tree. The girl shrieked with laughter and took off running. Nora chased her. Around the garden. Over the low stone wall. Through the rows of vegetables she had planted just yesterday. The other children joined the chase. They ran in circles, climbed trees, tumbled over each other. Miss Nora almost had me, Emma shouted. She is fast, fast. No one had ever called Nora fast. They played until the sun started to sink. Game after game. Nora was the hare twice. She hid in the barn loft. behind the water trough in the branches of the cherry tree. The children found her every time, but it did not matter. What mattered was the running, the hiding, the laughing. What mattered was being allowed to play. When the children finally headed home, Nora stood alone in the golden evening light. She was breathing hard. Her hair had fallen completely out of its pins. Her dress was dirty and grass-stained. She could not stop smiling. Wyatt walked over from the fence where he had been watching. He moved slowly like he was approaching something fragile. "You are happy," he said quietly. "I am." Nora laughed. A real laugh. The kind she had not made since she was a child. "I did not know I could still feel like this." "Feel like what?" "Free." She looked up at the sky, turning orange and pink. "My brother always said I would embarrass him if I ran around like that I was too big, too clumsy, that people would laugh." Did anyone laugh today? Nora thought about it. The children had laughed, but not at her, with her. "No," she admitted, "because there was nothing to laugh at." Wyatt's voice was firm. "He lied to you, Nora. Your brother lied about a lot of things." Nora looked at him, at this quiet, steady man who kept saying things that cracked her open. "I know he did. I am starting to understand that now." "You are not too much." Wyatt held her gaze. "You are just someone who was never allowed to be herself. Someone who was kept small because it was easier for the people around you." Tears burned in Nora's eyes. Good tears. Healing tears. "You are the first person who has ever told me that." Then everyone else was wrong. Silence stretched between them. The sun sank lower. The sky turned from pink to purple. "The children are coming back tomorrow," Wyatt said finally. "Emma told me. They want to play in the orchard again. They can come whenever they want." Nora wiped her eyes. "This place should be full of laughter. It has not been for a long time. Then we will change that." Wyatt studied her face. There was something new in his eyes, something warm. "We," he repeated. "We." Nora felt her face flush. "If I stay, I mean. If you want me to stay." "A week." That was what I offered. "I know. Week is almost up." Nora's heart hammered. "Do you want me to go?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and important. "No," Wyatt said quietly. "I do not want you to go." He turned and walked back toward the barn. Nora watched him go. Something was changing between them, something she did not have words for yet. But she was starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, this place could become a real home. That night she lay in the barn loft and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The apple tree, the pear tree, the cherry tree, trees she had climbed with her own hands, trees that had held her weight. She thought about Edmund and his cruel words, thought about all the years she had spent believing she was worthless. Then she thought about Wyatt, about the way he looked at her, about the choice he had offered her on the first day. Stay or go, it is your choice. No one had ever given her a choice before. She was starting to understand that a choice was a kind of freedom, and freedom was the beginning of everything. The church ladies came on the 6th day. Nora was kneading bread dough when she heard the wagon pull up outside. She looked through the window and saw 3 women climbing down dressed in their Sunday best, even though it was Wednesday. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Hendricks. The same women who had whispered about her at the train station. The same women who had attended Mrs. Patterson's Ladies' Aid Society meetings in the hotel back east. Nora's stomach dropped. Wyatt was in the barn. She was alone. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. "Good morning," she said quietly. Mrs. Patterson looked her up and down like she was examining livestock at market. "We need to speak with Mr. Garrett," she announced. "He is in the barn. I can fetch him if you. We will wait inside." Mrs. Patterson walked past Nora into the house without waiting for an invitation. The other 2 women followed. Nora stood frozen in her own kitchen. No, not her kitchen, Wyatt's kitchen. She was just a guest. Mrs. Patterson examined the room with sharp eyes. noted the bread rising on the counter, the coffee pot on the stove, the 2 cups on the table. "How long have you been here, dear?" Her voice dripped with false sweetness. 6 days, 6 days." Mrs. Patterson exchanged significant glances with the other women. "Living here alone with Mr. Garrett. Unmarried. I have my own room. In the barn loft. It is all proper." Mrs. Patterson's smile thinned. "No, dear, it certainly is not." The door opened. Wyatt came in. Saw the women. His jaw tightened. "Ladies," he said. His voice was flat. "Mr. Garrett." Mrs. Patterson drew herself up to her full height. "We have come about your situation. My situation. This woman," she gestured at Nora like she was pointing at a stray dog, "living here, unmarried. The talk in town is spreading." "What talk?" "That you brought in a mail-order bride who does not match her photograph." Mrs. Patterson's eyes glittered. "That she has been here for nearly a week with no wedding. That you are keeping her here for improper purposes." Nora felt her face burn with shame. Wyatt's voice went cold. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. We are not accusing anyone of sin, Mr. Garrett." Mrs. Patterson folded her hands primly. "We are simply concerned about appearances. This arrangement reflects poorly on the entire community." "Nora is my guest," Wyatt said. "She has done nothing wrong. Then marry her. Make it proper. Get out." The words cut through the room like a knife. "Mr. Garrett, really?" Mrs. Cooper started. "I said get out." Wyatt opened the door. "This is my property. She is my guest. What happens in my home is none of your business." The women left in a flurry of offended whispers and rustling skirts. The door closed behind them. Silence filled the kitchen. "I am sorry," Nora whispered. "I did not know they would come here. I did not mean to cause trouble. You have nothing to apologize for." Wyatt's hands were fists at his sides. "They have no right to say those things about you. But they are right about one thing." Nora could not meet his eyes. "I should not be here, not like this. It is not proper. Is that what you want? To leave?" "No." The word came out before she could stop it. "No, I do not want to leave. I want to stay. But not if it causes problems for you." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his face. Something she could not read. "Then we will figure it out." Thunder cracked outside. They both turned toward the window. Dark clouds were rolling in fast from the west, turning the afternoon sky black. "Storm is coming," Wyatt said. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. "I need to get to the south pasture. The gate latch is broken. If it gives way in this wind, I will lose half the herd." "What can I do?" The question surprised both of them. "You do not have to do anything," Wyatt said. "Stay here, stay safe." "What can I do?" He looked at her. Really looked. Then something in his face softened. "Come with me." They ran. The wind hit like a wall, cold and sharp and strong enough to steal Nora's breath. Rain followed seconds later. Hard driving rain that soaked through her dress in moments. Wyatt sprinted toward the south pasture. Nora followed. Her skirts were heavy with mud, her hair plastered to her face. She did not care. The gate was already swinging wild in the wind. 3 horses were spooked and running toward the open range. Panic in their eyes. Hooves pounding the wet earth. "Get behind them!" Wyatt shouted over the wind. "Drive them back toward me!" Nora did not think. She ran wide. Cut off the horses' escape. Made herself big. Made herself loud. The horses turned. Confused. Uncertain. Wyatt grabbed the gate. Fought it closed against the wind. The broken latch would not hold. Nora kept moving, kept shouting, kept the horses from bolting even as the rain poured down and the wind tried to knock her off her feet. Lightning split the sky. One horse reared up on its hind legs. Nora stumbled backward but did not stop. She waved her arms, shouted louder, drove it back toward the barn. Wyatt got the gate latched with a piece of rope. Temporary, but it would hold. Together they herded the last 2 horses into the barn. Inside, the rain hammered on the roof like 1,000 drums. They stood in the dark, breathing hard, soaked through, shaking. "You okay?" Wyatt asked. Nora nodded. She was shaking, but not from cold. You did not have to do that. His voice was rough. Yes, I did. He looked at her in the dim light of the barn. Really looked. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were scraped from the gate, and she was smiling. You are not afraid, he said quietly. Not afraid of storms. Not afraid of hard work. Not afraid of getting dirty. I have been afraid my whole life, Nora said. The words came from somewhere deep. Afraid of being too much, too big, too loud, too happy. I am tired of being afraid. Thunder rolled through the barn. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls. She was afraid, Wyatt said suddenly. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of the storm. Who? My fiancée, Margaret. She was afraid of everything out here. The work, the isolation, the weather. She wanted me to be something I was not. Go somewhere I did not belong. He looked at Nora. You are not afraid of any of it. The space between them felt charged, like the lightning outside. Then do not be afraid, Wyatt said. His voice was rough. Not here, not with me. Nora's heart pounded. The rain poured down. The world narrowed to this moment, this barn, this man. We should get inside, Wyatt said finally. Get dry. He stepped back. The spell broke. They ran through the rain to the house. Nora changed into dry clothes in her loft space. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from the way he had looked at her in the barn, from the words he had said, not here, not with me. She did not know what those words meant. Not yet, but she was starting to hope. Edmund arrived on the 7th day. Nora was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the wagon. She looked up and felt her blood turn to ice, her brother, and beside him Frank. They had come for her. She stood slowly, dirt on her hands, fear rising in her throat. All the courage she had built over the past week started to crumble. Wyatt came out of the barn, stopped when he saw the visitors. His face went hard. Edmund climbed down from the wagon with that thin, cruel smile Nora knew so well. Nora, he called cheerfully, I have come to take you home. I do not have a home with you. Her voice shook despite her best efforts. You do not have one here either. Edmund looked at Wyatt with contempt. She is still my ward, still my responsibility, and I have found her a proper husband. He gestured to Frank, who was climbing down from the wagon. Frank grinned that awful grin. He smelled of whiskey even from 20 feet away. No, Nora said. I will not go with him. You do not have a choice. Edmund pulled a folded paper from his coat. Legal guardianship documents. You are unmarried and under my authority. Either you come willingly or I will have the sheriff remove you. She is not going anywhere. Wyatt's voice was quiet but sharp as a blade. Edmund laughed. You think you can keep her? An unmarried woman living on your ranch? The whole town is talking. Mrs. Patterson sent me a letter. Said it was a scandal. Said you were keeping my sister in sin. That is not true. Does not matter if it is true. Edmund shrugged. Matters what people believe. And they believe you have been ruining her reputation. Frank stepped forward. His eyes crawled over Nora in a way that made her skin crawl. I am willing to marry her, Frank said. Take her off your hands, off Edmund's hands. Everyone wins. Nora felt the shame crawling back. The old words, the old weight, the familiar crushing certainty that she was worthless, unwanted, a burden to be passed from one man to another. She is right here, Edmund said with exaggerated patience. Frank is willing to make it legal, give you his name. You should be grateful. I would rather die. The words came out fierce and strong. Frank's expression darkened. You do not have better options. She does. Everyone turned. Wyatt walked forward slowly, stopped beside Nora, put himself between her and the two men who had come to take her. She is not your ward anymore, Edmund. What are you talking about? She is my wife. The world stopped. Nora stared at him. What? Wyatt did not look at her, kept his eyes locked on Edmund. We married 2 days ago. Quiet ceremony. Just us and the Reverend. She is Nora Garrett now, not yours to control. Edmund's face went red, then white. You are lying. Check with Reverend Miles if you want. His voice was iron. It is legal, recorded, done. Silence. Frank looked at Edmund. You said she was not married. She was not when I sent the letter, Edmund sputtered. I did not know. Let us go. Frank climbed back onto the wagon. I'm not getting between a man and his wife. That is a good way to get shot. Edmund stared at Nora, then at Wyatt, his face twisted with fury. You will regret this, he said quietly. Both of you. She is nothing but a burden, a mistake. You will see. Get off my land. Wyatt's voice left no room for argument. Edmund climbed onto the wagon. You deserve each other. They drove away. Dust rose behind them and slowly settled. Nora stood frozen, heart pounding, mind racing. I am sorry, Wyatt said. He turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. I should have asked first. I just could not let him take you. We are not married. No. You lied. Yes, he will find out. Nora's voice shook. He will check with the Reverend and find out you lied, and he will come back. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. Unless we make it true. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Marry me, Wyatt said. Today. Before he checks, before he comes back. It is the only way to keep you safe legally. If you are my wife, he cannot touch you. You do not want to marry me. I do not want him taking you. Wyatt's voice was rough. I do not want you going back to that life. I do not want you belonging to Frank or Edmund or anyone who does not see what I see. What do you see? He looked at her. Really looked. The way he had looked at her in the barn during the storm. Someone worth keeping. Nora's throat closed. Tears burned in her eyes. It would just be for protection, she said carefully. Not a real marriage. It would be legal. His jaw tightened. Beyond that, we can figure things out as we go. Nora looked at the garden she had brought back to life. At the house that was starting to feel like home. At the man who was offering her freedom in the only way he knew how. She thought about Edmund and Frank. About the life waiting for her if she went back. About the choice Wyatt was giving her, stay or go, safe or trapped, free or caged. Okay. Wyatt blinked. Okay. I will marry you. Relief flooded his face. Then something else. Uncertainty, maybe. Or hope. Reverend Miles can come at sunset. We will need witnesses. Wyatt turned toward the barn, then stopped. Nora. Yes? Thank you for trusting me. He walked away before she could respond. Nora stood alone in the garden she had planted, surrounded by growing things, about to marry a man who wanted to protect her but did not love her. She told herself it was enough. She told herself she did not need love. She was wrong about that, but she would not know it until later. The Reverend came at sunset, just as Wyatt had promised. Reverend Miles was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He did not ask questions about why they were marrying so quickly, did not judge or pry. He simply opened his Bible and began. 2 neighbors stood as witnesses, the Hendersons from the farm 3 miles east. They smiled at Nora like they were happy for her, like this was a normal wedding. It was not normal. None of this was normal. Nora wore her cleanest dress, the blue one she had brought from back east. It was plain and simple, but it was all she had. Wyatt wore his only suit, dark wool that looked like it had not been worn in years. His hair was combed back. His boots were clean. He looked handsome. Nora had not let herself notice that before. The ceremony took 5 minutes. They said the words, signed the paper. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife. Wyatt did not kiss her. The witnesses offered congratulations and left. The Reverend followed. The sun sank below the horizon. They stood alone in the small house. Married, strangers bound by law. I will sleep in the barn, Wyatt said. His voice was careful. You do not have to do that. Yes, I do. He looked at her with something that might have been regret. You are my wife now, but you are also someone who deserves respect. I will not pressure you for anything. I will not expect anything from you. Nora nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. He grabbed a blanket from the shelf, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. Good night, Mrs. Garrett. The door closed behind him. Nora stood alone in the house that was now legally hers. Mrs. Garrett. She was married, protected, safe. So why did she feel so empty? The first week of marriage was strange. Wyatt was careful, too careful. He worked from dawn until dark, ate his meals quickly, spoke only when necessary. He slept in the barn every night. Nora kept the house, cooked, cleaned, worked in the garden. She watched her vegetables grow, watched the trees she had climbed start to lose their leaves as autumn crept closer. They moved around each other like pieces on a game board, never touching, barely speaking. It was everything Edmund had said marriage would be: quiet, practical, loveless. Except Wyatt was kind, and that made it hurt worse, because Nora was starting to feel something she had not expected, something she had not asked for. She was starting to fall in love with her husband. She loved the way he worked without complaint, the way he treated the animals with gentleness, the way he had stood between her and Edmund without hesitation. She loved the way he had looked at her in the barn during the storm, the way his voice had roughened when he said, "Not here, not with me." She loved the way he had married her to keep her safe even though he barely knew her. But he did not love her back. He had married her out of duty, out of kindness, out of some need to protect someone who had nowhere else to go. That was not love. That was charity. And Nora was tired of being someone's charity case. On the 8th day of their marriage, everything changed. Nora was picking tomatoes in the garden when she heard children's voices. She looked up and saw Emma and her siblings running across the field toward the orchard. "Miss Nora?" Emma called. She stopped, corrected herself. "Mrs. Garrett, can we play in the orchard again?" "Of course," Nora smiled. The children were the bright spot in her strange new life. "I was hoping you would come back." They scattered into the trees. Nora watched them for a moment, then she followed. The smallest boy tried to climb the apple tree, got stuck halfway up, started to panic. "Hold on." Nora ran to him. She climbed up after him without thinking, found him clinging to a branch with his eyes squeezed shut. "I am scared," he whispered. "I am too heavy. The tree is going to break." "No, it is not." Nora's voice was firm. "This tree is strong. It has been standing for 40 years. It can hold both of us. Trust it." She helped him find his footing, guided him down branch by branch. When they reached the ground, he grinned up at her. "You are really good at climbing." "I am getting better." They played for hours. Nora chased the children through the orchard, climbed trees with them, hung upside down from branches, laughed until her sides hurt. At some point, a branch cracked under the smallest girl's weight. Nora caught her before she hit the ground. They tumbled into the grass together, both laughing. Again, the girl shouted, "Do that again." "Maybe not that part," Nora said, "but we can keep playing." The sun started to sink. The children headed home one by one. That was when Nora realized Wyatt was watching. He was standing near the barn. Had been standing there for a while, she realized. Just watching. She walked toward him slowly. Grass stains on her dress, hair falling out of its pins, face flushed and sweaty. "You look happy," Wyatt said quietly. "I am. You look different here." He stepped closer. "Free." Nora felt her heart start to pound. "I feel different here." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, then he spoke. "I have been thinking about something." "About what?" "About why I asked you to stay that first night. Why I married you. Why I cannot stop watching you." Nora could not breathe. "I told myself it was about doing the right thing." Wyatt's voice was rough. "About protecting someone who needed help. But that was not the whole truth." "What was the whole truth?" He looked at her, really looked. The way he had looked at her in the barn during the storm, the way he had looked at her when he said she could stay. "When I saw you step off that train," he said slowly, holding that little bag, looking terrified, "I did not see someone I had to take care of." "What did you see?" "Someone who had survived." His voice cracked. "Someone strong, someone real." "Wyatt, let me finish." He stepped closer. "Then you climbed that tree, ran with those children, fought that storm with me. And I kept thinking, this woman, this strong, brave woman, she deserves more than a marriage that is just protection." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "I married you to keep you safe," Wyatt continued. "But I want you to stay because, he took a breath, "because I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. "I am falling in love with you." Nora stared at Wyatt. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in every part of her body. "I know that is not what I offered you," Wyatt said quickly. "I know I promised nothing more than safety, nothing more than protection. If that is all you want, I will keep my distance. I will keep sleeping in the barn. I will not ask for more than you want to give." He looked at her with everything in his eyes. Hope, fear, love. "But I need you to know something, Nora. You are not a burden. You are not too much. You are not any of those things your brother told you." "What am I, then?" "Everything." His voice broke. "Everything I did not know I needed. And if you will have me, really have me, I want to be your husband, not just in name, in every way that matters." Nora's tears spilled over, hot and fast and unstoppable. "I thought no one would ever want me," she whispered. "Not really, not for who I am. I spent my whole life being told I was too big, too plain, too much. I believed it. I believed all of it. I know. I do not believe it anymore." She wiped her eyes. "You showed me that. You showed me I could climb trees and run through fields and take up space without apologizing. You showed me I was allowed to be happy." "You were always allowed," Wyatt said. "You just needed someone to tell you. You told me. I will tell you every day for the rest of my life, if you let me." Nora closed the distance between them, put her hand on his chest, felt his heart pounding as hard as hers. "I am not the woman in the photograph," she said quietly. "I do not want the woman in the photograph." Wyatt's voice was fierce. "I want the woman who climbs trees, who fights storms, who runs with children and laughs with dirt on her face. I want you, just you. I love you." The words came out easier than she expected. "I have loved you since the day you gave me a choice, since the day you showed me the garden and said it was worth saving." "You are worth saving, Nora. You always were." She stretched up on her toes. He bent his head. They kissed. Soft at first, tentative, like they were both afraid the other might disappear. Then deeper, stronger, like coming home. When they finally broke apart, they were both shaking. "Come inside," Nora whispered. "Come home." That night, Wyatt did not sleep in the barn. They lay together in the small house, talking until the stars came out. About their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, about the life they would build together on this ranch in the middle of nowhere. "I want to expand the garden," Nora said. "Plant more vegetables, maybe some flowers. Your mother started something beautiful here. I want to see it bloom. Then we will make it bloom. I want children someday. Running through that orchard, climbing those trees, however many you want." Wyatt pulled her closer. "I want a house full of noise and laughter and life. I want everything I thought I would never have. You will have it." Nora pressed her face against his shoulder. "We will have it. Together." They fell asleep wrapped around each other. Safe. Loved. Home. In the morning, Nora woke to sunlight streaming through the window. She was tangled in blankets and warmth and the solid presence of her husband beside her. Her husband. Not just in name anymore. in every way that mattered. She slipped out of bed quietly, pulled on her dress, walked to the window. The garden stretched out behind the barn, green and growing and full of life. The apple tree stood tall with the last of its fruit clinging to the branches. The cherry and pear trees were already turning gold. She had planted seeds in that garden, had climbed those trees, had found pieces of herself she did not know were missing. Wyatt's arms wrapped around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything." Nora leaned back against him. "How different my life is now. How grateful I am. Grateful for what?" "For you, for this place, for the chance to start over." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "You did not just start over, Nora. You bloomed." She smiled. The garden metaphor again. "It fits. You are like those trees my mother planted. Strong, beautiful, deep roots, something worth nurturing." Nora turned in his arms, looked up at his face. "I love you, Wyatt Garrett. I love you, Nora Garrett." They kissed again as the morning sun filled the room with gold. Outside, the children's voices drifted across the field. Emma and her siblings coming back to play in the orchard. "Sounds like we have visitors," Wyatt said. "Should I tell them to come back later?" "No," Nora smiled. "Let them play. I want this place to be full of laughter, full of life. Then that is what we will make it." They walked outside together, hand in hand. The children waved and shouted greetings. Nora waved back. She was home, finally truly home. And the best part was, she had found herself along the way. 3 months later, the garden had transformed completely. Nora stood at the edge of her vegetable beds and marveled at what they had built together. Rows of winter squash ready for harvest, cabbages, onions, herbs of every kind. The trees had lost their leaves, but they stood strong and tall against the winter sky. Patient, waiting for spring, just like her. She put her hand on her belly, still flat, but not for long. She had missed her courses twice now, had felt the familiar tiredness in her bones. There was a baby coming. She had not told Wyatt yet. Had been waiting for the right moment. Today felt right. He was in the barn working on a new crib. He did not know she knew about it, had caught him measuring wood and drawing plans late at night when he thought she was asleep. "Wyatt." She pushed open the barn door. He looked up quickly, tried to hide the wood behind him. "I was just—" He stopped, looked sheepish. "You were not supposed to see this, I know." She walked toward him. "I have known for weeks. I wanted it to be a surprise. It was." She reached him, took his hands in hers. "But I have a surprise for you, too." His eyes searched her face, dropped to her belly, widened. "Nora?" She nodded, tears already spilling down her cheeks. Happy tears, the happiest tears she had ever cried. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." Wyatt pulled her into his arms, held her so tight she could barely breathe. His shoulders shook. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I love you," he said. His voice cracked. "I love you so much. I love you too." They stood in the barn, surrounded by half-built furniture and future dreams. A family. They were going to be a family. That spring, the garden exploded with life. Nora planted twice as much as the year before. Vegetables, flowers, a new rose bush near the porch. Her belly grew round and full. She waddled through the rows of her garden, pulling weeds and checking on her seedlings. The children still came to play. Emma was taller now, already talking about wanting to be a teacher someday. "Mrs. Garrett is going to have a baby," Emma told her siblings importantly. "She let me feel it kick." Wyatt built an addition to the house, another bedroom, a nursery. He built a swing for the apple tree, a little chair for the porch. He built a life, and Nora bloomed right alongside him. On a warm June morning, their daughter arrived, small and perfect with her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Rose, for the garden that had saved her mother, for the beauty that could grow from nothing. Nora held her daughter in her arms and cried. She thought about Edmund, about the cruel words he had spoken, about the years she had spent believing she was worthless. She thought about the train ride west, the terror and the uncertainty, the photograph of a woman she was not. She thought about Wyatt standing on that platform, looking at her with tired eyes, offering her something no one else ever had. A choice. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. "You and your father, and this place. I did not know life could be this good." Outside the window, the garden bloomed in full summer glory. Roses and tomatoes and sunflowers reaching for the sky. The apple tree stood tall and strong, ready for another generation of children to climb its branches. Nora smiled. She had come west with nothing. An unwanted woman sent away like cargo. She had found everything. 5 years later, Nora stood on the porch of her home and watched her children play. Rose was 4 now, wild and fearless with grass stains on every dress she owned. She climbed the apple tree every day, higher than Nora had ever dared. Little Thomas was 2, toddling after his sister with determination in his eyes, falling down, getting up, falling down again. The garden stretched out behind them. Bigger now, 3 times the size it had been when Nora first arrived. Vegetables and flowers and fruit trees, a proper orchard. Emma came every week to help with the children. She was 16 now and beautiful, already courting a young man from town. "You saved me, you know," Emma said one afternoon. "When I was little and you caught me falling from that tree, I caught you because I knew what it felt like to fall." Nora smiled. "And I knew what it felt like to have someone catch you." The mail came once a week. Most of it was ordinary. Supply orders, letters from neighbors. But sometimes there was a letter from back east, from people who had known her before. "Edmund died," one letter said. 2 years after Nora left. Drank himself to death in the same hotel where she had scrubbed pots. No one came to his funeral. Nora had cried when she read that letter. Not from grief, from something more complicated. Relief, maybe. Sadness for the brother he could have been. She burned the letter and did not speak of it again. The church ladies had apologized eventually. Mrs. Patterson moved away after her husband lost his job. The others had watched Nora and Wyatt build their life together, and finally admitted they had been wrong. "She is good for him," they said now. "Look at that garden. Look at those children." Nora did not need their approval, but she accepted it gracefully. That was what strong people did. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Wyatt took Nora to the top of the hill behind their ranch, the same hill where she had first seen her new home. The view stretched out in every direction, mountains and fields and the little house that had become everything. "I have something for you," Wyatt said. He handed her a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small green stone. "I never gave you a proper ring," he said. "We married so fast. I wanted you to have something beautiful." Nora slipped it on her finger. It fit perfectly. "I already have something beautiful," she said. "I have you. I have our children. I have this life. You have more than that." Wyatt took her hand. "You have yourself, the woman you were always meant to be." Nora looked out at the landscape spreading before them, at the ranch, the garden, the trees she had climbed. She thought about the girl who had arrived here 6 years ago, terrified and ashamed, believing every cruel thing her brother had ever said. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had planted gardens and raised children and built a life from nothing. A woman who had finally been allowed to bloom. "I am happy," she said. The words felt like a prayer. "I am so happy, Wyatt." He pulled her close, pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You deserve to be happy. You always did." They stood on the hilltop as the sun sank toward the horizon. Golden light spilled across the land they had built together. Below them, Rose's laughter drifted up from the orchard. She was climbing the apple tree again, higher than ever. "She is going to fall," Nora said. "She will be fine." Wyatt smiled. She is her mother's daughter, strong enough to climb, brave enough to reach for what she wants. Nora smiled back. That was what she had wanted all along, not just for herself but for her children, for everyone who had ever been told they were too much. Permission to climb, permission to reach, permission to bloom. She had found it here on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, with a man who saw her for who she really was. And she would spend the rest of her life making sure everyone she loved felt the same. The sun set, the stars came out. Nora and Wyatt walked home together, hand in hand. Behind them, the apple tree stood tall against the darkening sky, its branches reaching upward, its roots digging deep. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being a part of our community, strong enough to hold anyone who dared to climb.